This is where we take a monumental stack of technical reports, political manifestos, and raw academic data, and we try to distill it all into indispensable knowledge.
And today, we're wrestling with a question that, it really hits at the absolute core of American
It
democracy.
really does. The question is, how much convenience are we willing to trade for certainty?
That is the perfect way to frame it. Our deep dive today is into the world of mobile voting, this vision that you should be able to cast a legally binding ballot on your smartphone, as simply as you might pay a bill.
But we're juxtaposing that vision with these really intense unified warnings from virtually every major cybersecurity expert and election integrity organization out there.
And they're all basically saying that doing so introduces catastrophic, just unmanageable risks.
The sources we've managed to pull together for you today are, they're rich, but they're also deeply contradictory. We've got material directly from the philanthropic side, from the venture capital initiatives that are funding these apps.
Right. And alongside that, you have these brutally honest public security audits.
The reverse engineering of some of the early apps by researchers at MIT, for instance.
Exactly. And we've layered that with academic studies looking at voter behavior, at coercion, and then the latest government reports that are tracking the hyperpolarized state of election legislation across the country.
So our mission for you, the learner, is to really unpack the competing priorities that define this whole debate. Is the political necessity of boosting turnout, of getting what some call the moderate majority back to the polls, is that worth the inherent technical risk?
And maybe more importantly, how exactly do the advocates for this technology claim they're solving problems that election security veterans insist are, completely unsolvable?
Okay, let's start with the central figure who's really pushing this entire movement forward. He's a political strategist and venture capitalist named Bradley Tusk.
And for Tusk, his motivation isn't really about technology. It's about what he sees as a deep political crisis. He looks at low voter turnout, specifically in primaries, and sees that as the root cause of extremism and dysfunction in U.S. politics.
Right. His diagnosis, which he lays out pretty clearly, is that when only, say, 10 or 12% of the registered electorate shows up for a primary, those voters are the most ideologically committed. They're the ones on the far ends of the political spectrum.
Which leaves the moderate, the sensible center, feeling detached and unrepresented. The system just ends up rewarding and promoting more and more political extremism.
The logic is pretty compelling when you lay it out like that. If you make voting radically easier, you drastically increase participation.
And that new wave of voters, presumably more moderate, pulls the entire political system back toward the center. Tusk's goal is all about radical participation. He wants to take primary turnout from 12% to maybe 35% or even 40%.
Using the one device that pretty much everyone has in their pocket.
The smartphone.
But this compelling political argument, it immediately just hits a wall of resistance from the cybersecurity community.
A brick wall. Experts like Professor J. Alex Halderman at the University of Michigan or others with these deep backgrounds in cryptography and cyber warfare, they universally caution against any form of remote internet voting.
So what's their core non-negotiable red line? What's the one thing they just won't budge on?
It all boils down to trust and control. They state, and I mean unequivocally, that without a reliable voter-verified paper record, a physical thing that you can count in audit elections simply cannot be secured against sophisticated targeted attacks.
So the moment the vote leaves the polling place, it's vulnerable.
That's their argument. The second a vote is cast outside of an election official's control, so on your personal smartphone or your laptop, and then transmitted electronically, integrity is lost. They say no amount of advanced math or cryptography, which we will get into, can solve the fundamental problem of trusting an infected device.
Wow. Okay, so that really sets the stage. Political necessity versus what some see as a technical impossibility. Let's dive into Section 2 and see how Tusk Philanthropies actually moved from theory to action.
Right, how they started driving mobile access over the past few years. The initiative began with a very specific and strategic focus. They weren't trying to convert the general electorate right away.
No, they targeted groups with inherent barriers, right?
Exactly. Voters who traditional voting methods just don't serve well. First, the UOCAVIA population, that's the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. So we're talking active military, their families, and citizens living abroad.
And the second group?
Voters with disabilities. For both of these groups, accessibility is a massive, life-altering issue.
That makes a lot of sense politically. If you can prove the concept works for a soldier deployed in Afghanistan or for a voter who can't physically hold a pen to mark a ballot, you build a really powerful moral and political foundation for your argument.
Precisely. And this wasn't done quietly. Since 2018, Tusk Philanthropies has supported and funded pilots in over 20 elections across 7 states:
Let me see if I remember them. Colorado, Oregon, South Carolina.
Utah, Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia. These are all tactical, local, and primary elections. They were designed to gather data and prove feasibility, but on a really small scale.
In the early stage of these pilots, it centered heavily on one particular app, Voatz. I know West Virginia was the first state to adopt it for ULKVA members in a 2018 primary.
That's right. And it's worth walking through what that user journey was like for those early adopters.
How did it work?
The process was designed to be pretty rigorous, even in its simplicity. So a UOKV voter would download the Voatz app, and then registration required some sophisticated ID verification.
Not just typing in your name.
No. You had to take a high-quality photo of a government ID, like a passport or military ID, and then you had to record a short video selfie. The system then often used facial recognition, and in some cases, thumbprint verification, to link that user to their ballot securely.
Okay, so it's a multi-factor process. And the data coming out of these early tests, especially from Utah County, seemed to really validate Tusk's core thesis about turnout.
Absolutely. Utah County, they initially ran a pilot for UO voters, and then they expanded it to include disabled voters in a municipal primary. And the results, as reported by the clerk auditor Amelia Powers Gardner, were striking.
What were the numbers?
In that pilot, UO turnout hit 38%. Now compare that to the general population turnout in the same election, which was hovering between 24% and 25%.
Wow, that's a huge jump, over 10 percentage points.
It's massive, and it was directly attributed to the ease of use. Powers Gardner said explicitly that the accessibility of the app was the clear driver for the increased participation from this, highly mobile and traditionally difficult to reach population.
That 38% figure is key then, because it moves the whole debate from just theoretical convenience to, measurable functional engagement.
It does, but it also raises the next big question.
How did they maintain that crucial physical audit trail that the security experts are always demanding?
This is the critical sort of bridging step in the process. Once the user marked their ballot in the app, the system didn't just send the vote straight to the final tally.
Okay.
Instead, the encrypted ballot went into what they called a virtual lockbox. Then, on election day, election officials would open that lockbox, take the digital receipt of the cast ballot, and print off a physical paper ballot.
And that paper ballot was then treated like any other.
Exactly. It was fed into the existing optical scanners, just like a traditional mail-in ballot.
Yeah.
This mechanical process ensured there was a physical paper analog for every digital vote cast, which, in theory, allowed for traditional auditing.
So in those early pilots, the security really depended entirely on whether that printed ballot accurately reflected the voter's intent,
Right.
and whether that electronic transmission to the lockbox was secure in the first place.
Precisely. And this whole initiative, it's underpinned not just by the technology, but by Tusk's political calculation. He calls his long-term strategy the slippery slope.
The slippery slope strategy. I mean, that's a bold name to give it, considering the negative connotations that phrase usually carries in policy debates.
It is, but he fully embraces it. His philosophical bet is rooted in behavioral economics.
Which is?
That once a voter experiences a significantly better, faster, and more convenient way to participate in democracy, they will not tolerate going back to the old, harder methods. It's the difference between, hailing a cab on the street versus using a rideshare app.
He wants to prove the technology is just so superior that it creates an unstoppable demand for it.
Yep. He views the adoption as inevitable, simply because convenience always wins out.
So how does he plan to execute this slow, calculated release of the genie from the bottle?
He's planning an incremental scale-up over a decade. He's deliberately focused on low-stakes election school boards, municipal councils, where the national political consequences of an error are pretty minimal.
Build trust through small, repeated successes.
That's the idea. He's publicly stated that he has no interest in rushing something like VoteSecure, their new platform, for a high-stakes event like the 2028 presidential election. He understands that success requires a measured approach built on these incremental proof points.
Okay, so let's talk about the technical hurdles that forced Tusk to pivot. Because that early reliance on apps like Voatz, it very quickly generated some major security alarms.
It did. And that pivot was a recognition of a really harsh reality. The early apps, while functional, just did not meet the rigorous security demands of the industry. So Tusk poured massive capital into building a solution from the ground up.
This is where VoteSecure comes in.
Right. He funded the development of VoteSecure, which is an open-source software development kit, and he collaborated with the election tech firm Free and Fair. This was not a cheap endeavor. The investment totaled around $20 million.
$20 million, flowing into a technology that the overwhelming consensus of cybersecurity experts has deemed fundamentally insecure. That's a huge bet.
It's a massive bet.
So what is VoteSecure trying to achieve that the earlier apps failed at?
The technical goal is to achieve something called end-to-end verifiable internet voting, or E2EVV. This is kind of the cryptographic holy grail of remote voting.
Okay, break that down for us. What does E2EVV actually try to prove?
It aims to use advanced mathematics to prove three things simultaneously. One, that the vote was recorded exactly as the voter intended. Two, that it was securely included in the public tally. And three, that the tally itself is accurate. And it has to do all of that without ever revealing who cast which ballot.
You promised we'd get into the math, and this is where it gets dense. E2EVV relies on techniques with names like homomorphic tallying and Benelot challenges. Can you give us a high-level conceptual breakdown of what those are?
I'll try. Let's start with homomorphic tallying. Imagine you have a locked, sealed box full of votes. Normally, to count them, you'd have to unlock the box, read each vote, and then add them up. If the votes are encrypted, you can't read them, so you can't add them. Homomorphic encryption is this mathematical trick that allows you to perform operations, like adding up all the yes votes while the data is still encrypted and inside that sealed box.
So you're adding up numbers you can't see.
Exactly. Only once the entire encrypted total is reached is the final result publicly decrypted. The individual ballots remain secret, but the mathematical operation itself is publicly verifiable.
So the count is auditable, but the individual inputs stay invisible until the very end. That's fascinating. And what about the Benelot challenges?
Benelot challenges are part of the voter verifiability side of things. They allow voters to probabilistically check that their vote was included correctly without exposing the actual vote.
How does that work?
Essentially, the system might ask the voter to prove that their ballot was handled correctly by performing a challenge like proving they received the correct digital receipt. This can be verified through a cryptographic proof without revealing the actual contents of the ballot. The CEO of Free and Fair, Joe Keenery, he described this complex protocol as the hardest, most interesting, chewy thing at the middle of the whole application.
It sounds like an enormous amount of intellectual firepower is being directed at this one technical problem. But beyond just security, Tusk's team also invested heavily in usability and accessibility. That led to the VoteHub project, right?
That's a crucial development, yes. Early alpha versions of the apps got a lot of criticism for poor user experience, especially for disabled voters who rely on things like screen readers.
So VoteHub was built to fix that?
Exactly. They transitioned the beta application to use React Native, which is a platform known for its flexibility, and they focused specifically on optimizing the architecture for screen readers and integrating design tokens to meet really stringent accessibility guidelines. The Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, or VVSG.
And did that focused effort actually translate into better confidence and easier use for people?
According to their mock election feedback, yes, it did. They tested the app with over 400 users, and the confidence levels were nearly unanimous. Almost 100% of participants said they'd want to use the technology to vote in the future.
And you have quantitative data on that?
We do. The voter registration lookup flow, for example. In the earlier alpha version, it took a blind user 5 or 6 minutes to get through it. In the new VVSG-optimized beta, that time was cut in half.
That's a significant improvement.
It is. The designers were really careful to use the device's default accessibility settings for things like contrast and text size, making sure the app didn't conflict with the user's established preferences. It was a massive focus on accessibility as a core design principle, not just some afterthought.
Okay, so we thoroughly examined the optimistic vision. High turnout, complex cryptography, accessible design. But now we have to confront the warnings. Let's flip the coin and plunge into Section 3, the brutal technical reality, starting with why the traditional defenses that election officials rely on just fail.
This is where the worldview of a security expert, championed by people like J. Alex Halderman, provides the necessary counterpoint. Election officials often rely on two core defenses. The first is the decentralized nature of the U.S. election system, the idea that you'd have to hack 10,000 different jurisdictions.
And the second is the air gap.
The air gap, physical separation from the internet. Sounds like the ultimate defense mechanism.
It does. So why is it insufficient against a sophisticated attacker?
Because the air gap is routinely, if unintentionally, bypassed. It's a defensive convenience, not of certainty. The critical weakness happens during the ballot programming process.
Which is when you're setting up the machines for a specific election.
Right. Every voting machine has to be configured with the data on the candidates, the races, the machine settings.
And that configuration is rarely done directly on the air-gapped machine itself, is it?
Almost never. The programming is often done on separate, internet-connected computers that generate the data. That data is then loaded onto the air-gapped voting machine via an external memory card or a USB drive.
And crucially, that programming is often outsourced to third-party vendors.
Or handled by local election staff whose computers are, of course, connected to the internet.
So if I'm a nation-state actor, I don't target the heavily defended voting machine. I target the vendor or the local clerk's administrative PC. Walk us through that attack chain.
Okay, let's track it. The attacker starts with a sophisticated spear phishing campaign, targeting an employee at that third-party vendor or in the local election office.
A fake email, a malicious link.
Exactly. The employee clicks on it, and their connected computer gets infected with malware. This malware then just sits there, dormant, waiting. When the employee plugs in a memory card to prepare the ballot programming for the upcoming election, the malware infects the memory card.
And just like that, the air gap is breached.
Correct. The moment that infected memory card is inserted into the air-gapped voting machine, the malware leaps across the air gap. It can then alter vote counts, introduce hidden vulnerabilities, even erase logs. This isn't theoretical. It's a documented, successful attack methodology. It's a known way to weaponize supply chains.
And the catastrophe is truly realized when these compromised machines are paperless.
That is the ultimate failure point. When you have paperless voting machines, like older versions of the AccuVote TSX, which were still being used in 21 states as recently as 2016 if the vote totals are tampered with, there is, and I quote, no way to recover.
Because there's no physical record to count.
Nothing. The electronic totals are untrustworthy, and the election result is simply lost.
Therefore, the security community's unanimous demand is not just for paper records, but for rigorous auditing of those records.
Precisely. They mandate voter-verified paper records and something called risk-limiting audits, or RLAs.
Explain what an RLA is.
An RLA is a scientifically based statistical audit. So instead of counting every single ballot by hand, you count a small randomized fraction of them. If the hand count of that fraction matches a machine count within a certain statistical confidence level, say 95% or 99%, you stop. You've statistically confirmed the accuracy of the electronic count without having to recount millions of ballots.
It moves election auditing from a political exercise into a rigorous science.
That's the goal.
Okay, so that sets the necessary standard.
Yeah.
Now let's pivot to the mobile apps themselves. In 2020, MIT researchers performed a security analysis on Voatz, the app used in many of those early pilots, and the findings exposed a fundamental architectural collapse.
It was a devastating report. The researchers publicly detailed their entire methodology, which involved reverse engineering the Android application. And they concluded that Voatz possessed numerous severe security vulnerabilities.
Vulnerabilities that a sophisticated attacker could exploit to do what?
To compromise the election, to steal votes, or even just to learn the voters' choices.
Let's break down the three most critical vulnerabilities they found, starting with device compromise. This one seems to directly undermine the entire premise of E2E Viva.
It does. The problem here is that the foundation of the whole system's security, the voter's own phone, is completely outside the control of election officials.
Right.
Now, Voatz tried to mitigate this. They used security features, specifically something called the Imperium SDK, which is designed to detect if a phone was rooted or jailbroken states that grant deep, unrestricted access to the operating system.
And what did the MIT team find regarding this crucial defense?
They found it was, well, laughably easy to bypass. An attacker with root access to a voter's device could evade Voatz's detection mechanisms almost instantly. The researchers reported they only needed 4 lines of code to completely disable this Imperium SDK.
4 lines of code. To dismantle the central defense mechanism of an election app that was being used in state pilots. We need to pause on the gravity of that specific finding. If that defense fails so easily, what does it mean for the integrity of the vote?
It means the entire system is built on sand. If an attacker bypasses that detection, They have control of the client device, the source of the vote. They could track the user's choices in real time. They could even display the voter's true choice on the screen, making the voter feel totally secure, but simultaneously send an altered, suppressed, or completely different vote to the server.
That's the core client attack problem.
It is. And it's the one that cryptographers can't solve, because the encryption only begins after the untrusted device has already processed the data.
The phone becomes a Trojan horse in the voter's pocket. What was the second critical vulnerability they found related to login security?
This was the issue of authentication leaks. When a user logged into Voatz, their sensitive data, including their 8-digit PIN and other login info, was found to be passing through the application's memory.
And not in protected storage.
Critically, it was not stored exclusively in protected hardware like the Android key store, which is designed precisely for sensitive cryptographic keys and user credentials.
Why is storing a PI in an application memory rather than a protected key store such a fundamental architectural mistake?
It's just basic security hygiene. When credentials reside unprotected in application memory, any attacker who manages to compromise the application, even remotely, can steal that data. This means a remote adversary could get the voter's PI and login details, allowing them to impersonate the user to the vote servers.
And cast a vote on their behalf.
Or even delete the voter's registration.
And the third vulnerability was a problem of just passive eavesdropping on the network.
That was perhaps the most unsettling finding: the network side channel attack. The researchers found that even a completely passive network adversary, someone who is just monitoring the data traffic between the phone and the server, without actively injecting malware, could potentially recover a user's secret ballot.
How?
They could infer the vote choice just by observing the network communication protocol. This means the promise of the secret ballot could be undermined by merely having access to network logs. It destroys the fundamental privacy guarantee of an election.
Now, Voatz and other early developers, they heavily touted the use of blockchain technology as a key security feature. They claimed its immutability would protect the tally. What did the security community say about that?
They pretty much dismissed it as a distraction, or worse. The consensus is that blockchain introduces enormous complexity without solving any of the foundational problems we just discussed, namely device compromise and coercion.
I remember a quote from a computer scientist on this.
Andrew Apple. He summarized the sentiment perfectly, stating, "There's no insecurity of internet voting that blockchain does not make worse." The National Academy of Sciences also explicitly warned that blockchain does little to address major security requirements like voter verifiability, and that simpler methods achieve the same benefits without all the overhead.
So we have the technical nightmare laid out, but the dangers of remote voting aren't just technical, they are deeply social. Let's move to the problem of coercion and vote buying, a vulnerability that no firewall or encryption can solve.
This is a massive security flaw, and it's inherent to remote voting. The secret ballot is protected in person by the physical architecture of the polling place, the booth, the supervision of the election workers.
All of that goes away when you're voting at home.
Right. When voting happens remotely, away from those officials, there is no guarantee of secrecy, making it ripe for coercion and vote buying.
Researchers ran a study with 150 participants in a mock election to gauge the perceived scale of this risk. What did they discover about the prevalence of coercion?
The findings were stunning, and this number deserves some serious reflection. A quarter of the participants, 26%, reported either personal experience with or direct knowledge of someone who had experienced some form of voter coercion or vote buying.
26%. That is a distressingly high social security flaw. That is not a fringe anomaly. That's a fundamental, pervasive social reality being reported.
It really is.
And who were the primary sources of this coercion?
When researchers asked participants to identify the perceived sources, family members, what the study termed S family, were cited as the predominant source. They accounted for 15% of all reported instances.
And what did that look like?
It included multiple accounts of spousal oversight, or one family member just insisting on being present during the voting process to dictate or monitor the choice.
That paints a dark picture of domestic oversight, the exact antithesis of the secret ballot. How can any technology counteract a coercer who can simply stand over your shoulder or demand to see your device?
That's the challenge. The coercer has persistent, unrestricted access. They can stay with their relative or hold on to their device until the vote is cast. This makes common technical solutions like deniable revoting, where you cast a new vote to cancel an old one, totally ineffective.
Because the coercer can just force you to revote again.
And again. This led researchers to test a complex but fascinating potential fix called the TRIP system.
The trapeze system, which uses fake voting credentials. Explain the theory behind this mechanism.
The idea is pure security theater, but for a good purpose. The system issues voters with fake credentials, like a second login or a test ballot, that look completely identical to the real voting interface.
So if a voter is under coercion,
They can use the fake credential to cast a vote that looks legitimate to the coercer, but which the system secretly and silently omits from the final tally. The voter's real secret vote can then be cast separately, later, or through another unmonitored channel.
that is highly conceptual. Did participants in the study actually understand that sophisticated psychological and technical defense mechanism?
They did, surprisingly well. 96% of participants grasped the concept of the fake credentials, and more than half, 53%, said they would definitely use the fake credential mechanism if they felt pressured in a real scenario.
That shows a high acceptance rate for a pretty complex idea.
It does, but security often comes with a usability trade-off.
What was the risk of voters getting confused?
The risk was immediate and significant. Despite that high comprehension, 10% of the participants who were testing the system mistakenly voted with the fake credential.
10%.
Let's reflect on that 10% error rate. If you scale that nationally, a system designed to protect the integrity of the vote would simultaneously result in a massive number of accidentally suppressed ballots. That is a fundamental usability failure and a severe threat to election fairness.
It's a profound failure of design. And the study also found that increasing voter vigilance seemed to lower the overall user experience.
Yes. They tested the impact of security education priming voters to be vigilant and warning them about malicious systems. And this priming, it did improve their ability to detect a maliciously configured system significantly, a 47% detection rate compared to 10% without priming. But this constant state of vigilance resulted in measurably lower overall user experience scores. The core takeaway is clear. Security requires discomfort. The search for radical convenience and perfect security are often mutually exclusive goals.
Okay, if the U.S. context is a security minefield, we have to look at the international model often cited by proponents, Estonia. They have been running successful, legally binding internet elections for nearly 2 decades.
Estonia is the exception that proves the rule, and it provides a crucial comparative study. They became the first nation to hold legally binding general elections over the internet way back in 2005 for municipal elections, followed by parliamentary elections in 2007.
Their system is called iVoting, and it's intrinsically linked to their national infrastructure, right?
Completely. The foundation is the mandatory national identity smart card. Estonia created a comprehensive public key infrastructure where this card functions as a legally binding digital ID. It allows for secure remote authentication and serves as a legally valid digital signature.
So it's not just a standalone app, it's integrated into their whole national governance system.
That's the key difference. And this infrastructure has led to massive adoption. In the 2023 parliamentary elections, more than half of the total votes cast were done so over the internet.
That level of adoption is unparalleled anywhere in the world. But even with 2 decades of apparent success, why does the international security community, experts from the OSCE, for instance, still flag major transparency and verifiability issues?
Because the system, despite its popularity, still doesn't meet the core security standards of end-to-end verifiability. In 2013, Estonia did implement a vote verification step using a smartphone app and a QR code.
But it wasn't a full verification.
No. That feature only verifies that the vote was received and stored on the server for a short time, usually 30 to 60 minutes. The voter cannot directly verify that their vote was correctly tallied in the final results. They can verify their intent was received, but not that their vote survived manipulation during the counting phase.
That distinction between receipt verification and tally verification is vital. What about transparency regarding the code itself?
There's a lack of full transparency. Due to social and political pressure, the election officials did publish the server-side source code on GitHub back in 2013.
But not the client-side code.
They continue to withhold the voting client's source code, the code that actually runs on the user's computer. Their rationale is that publishing it would allow malicious actors to build fake voting clients that could compromise the entire system.
So they're essentially saying, trust us, the client is secure.
Which is an unacceptable proposition for any independent security expert.
And the international warnings haven't softened over time.
Not at all. International security experts and OSCO-DHR observers consistently warn that any system transmitting ballots electronically cannot be secure. The warnings have been dramatic. A team of international experts in 2014 publicly claimed they could breach the Estonian system, change votes, alter totals, and erase all evidence of their actions if they could install malware on the election servers.
And while Estonian authorities pushed back,
The independent assessment from the OSCO-DHR observers remains consistent. The system lacks consistent end-to-end verifiability. Estonia proves that a popular functional system can still be viewed by cyber warfare experts as fundamentally unsound.
that brings us back to the U.S. context and the hyper-polarized political environment where any new voting technology is supposed to land. Let's dive into Section 5, the legislative battleground that's being tracked by the Brennan Center.
This policy context is so crucial because it shows that while technology proponents are pushing for radical convenience, state legislatures are focused on either increasing access or erecting new barriers around traditional methods like mail-in voting. It's a conflict between two opposing political forces.
Okay, let's start with the restrictive trends that are making voting harder.
As of October 2025, at least 16 states have enacted 29 restrictive voting laws. And that's just one law short of the record high set in 2021. It signals a really intensely focused effort to make it harder for eligible voters to register, stay on the rolls, or cast a ballot.
Where are these restrictions primarily focused?
They're heavily focused on dismantling accessible mail voting options and tightening voter list maintenance. For mail voting, we see specific tactics. Arkansas enacted a law requiring voters to complete an additional witness affidavit in front of an authorized person, adding a new logistical barrier.
And I saw Kansas and North Dakota eliminated the grace period for late arriving mail ballots.
That's right. Ballots now have to physically arrive by Election Day, even if they're postmarked on time. That's a measure that disproportionately affects military and overseas voters who rely on the Postal Service. And North Dakota also eliminated the option to drop off a mail ballot at a polling place on Election Day.
What about the restrictive push on maintaining the voter rolls, the purges?
At least 6 states enacted 7 laws that increase the risk of wrongly removing eligible voters. These laws often mandate the use of unreliable or poorly matched data sources for list maintenance, or they lower the standards required to justify removing a voter from the rolls. This just heightens the risk of improper voter disenfranchisement.
But despite this restrictive momentum, we're also seeing robust, expansive trends happening simultaneously in other states.
That's right. At least 25 states enacted 30 expansive voting laws aiming to increase access. These laws target areas like registration, early voting, and language access. Rhode Island created a no-excuse permanent mail voting list, which simplifies the process for regular mail voters. Connecticut mandated curbside voting and significantly expanded protocols to translate election materials, increasing access for voters with disabilities and those with limited English proficiency.
We also see states passing seemingly contradictory legislation in the same session.
This is the sign of the hyperpolarized environment. Kentucky, for instance, passed a law that tightened ID requirements, a restrictive measure, but at the same time, they expanded eligibility for early in-person voting, which is an expansive measure.
But what is most notable about the 2025 legislative session, though, is the shift in the balance between these two trends.
That's the key takeaway. Historically, expansive laws have often dramatically outnumbered restrictive ones, sometimes by 2 or 3 to 1. But in 2025, the number of expansive laws is virtually on par with the restrictive laws.
The fight is becoming more evenly matched.
It signals that the legislative fight over the rules of democracy is reaching an apex of polarization. And crucially, 14 states passed both restrictive and expansive laws at the same time, suggesting these intense, high-stakes legislative bargains where small, targeted barriers are traded for marginal access points.
Moving beyond access, let's look at that third category, election interference laws.
At least 7 states enacted 8 laws focused on election interference. These laws are characterized by granting state officials, often partisan political appointees, increased, unprecedented authority over local election processes, administration, and results.
So it shifts power away from local officials.
Away from experienced, nonpartisan local election officials and toward state-level political actors, increasing the opportunity for partisan manipulation of the system.
And finally, many of these restrictive laws are rooted in the persistent, though debunked, myth of widespread non-citizen voting.
This is a prominent political talking point that's directly driving policy. Despite repeated, verifiable findings that non-citizen voting is vanishingly rare, some states are making registration dependent on proving citizenship, with specific documents.
Like Indiana and Wyoming.
Exactly. They enacted laws requiring certain voters to present a passport or a birth certificate just to register. Florida went even further, establishing a new felony for voting by a non-citizen, even if that person genuinely believed they were eligible.
So this political environment means that the technological push for radical convenience in mobile voting is running headlong into state legislatures that are intent on increasing barriers and scrutiny, even for traditional established voting methods.
It's a total collision course.
Okay, let's synthesize all of this conflict in our final section.
Yeah.
We have Tusk saying technology can save democracy, and we have the Haldermans of the world saying technology will break it, all while legislatures are fighting over paper ballots. Where does the friction truly lie?
The friction lies at the point of origin, the user's device. Tusk's goal of radical inclusion runs headlong into the inherent, non-negotiable vulnerabilities of client-side computing.
The political desire for a smooth, app-based election is just fundamentally incompatible with the security need for control, isolation, and auditability.
That's it. The core vulnerability is that any remote electronic voting system relies on trusting a device, your smartphone, that is designed to be connected, personalized, and most importantly, routinely infected.
So the security experts, they're setting a standard that current mobile voting technology simply cannot meet, regardless of how many cryptographers are working on it.
They demand two things that are currently unsolvable in the remote context: perfect verifiability and coercion resistance. Even sophisticated E2 E5E systems like VoteSecure have to address the client attack, proving that malware on the voter's phone didn't change the vote between what was on the screen and what was sent to the server.
And they have to protect against coercion.
A problem that traditional paper ballots inherently solve by forcing the voter into that one moment of privacy inside the voting booth.
This brings us back to that profound difference in perspective between the political.
As, high cost, high complexity technical hurdles that $20 million and years of cryptographic research can ultimately conquer. He believes the resulting boost in turnout will redeem the democratic process.
But the security expert.
The security expert views the entire effort as fundamentally flawed because the foundation, the client device, can't be trusted. That means the system is inherently vulnerable to state-level cyber threats, and no amount of fancy math can change that.
This tension leaves us with one provocative final thought for you to consider as you contemplate the future of democracy.
We spent a significant amount of time detailing the threat of coercion. We learned that a quarter of mock election participants reported personal experience with or knowledge of family-based coercion, and that family members were the most cited source of this pressure.
This pressure spousal oversight, dictated votes. It happens in the voter's home, behind closed doors.
So given that persistent, undeniable social reality, is the greatest security challenge facing the implementation of remote voting truly technical? Is it a battle of firewalls, sophisticated encryption keys, and detection software? Or is it the pervasive, often inescapable social pressure that exists within the family unit, which remote voting makes tragically easy to enforce and which no app can ever stop?